In the first part of the video, we have shown you how the PAP has forced Singaporeans to give them our CPF so that they have earned billions from our CPF, whereas Singaporeans are still left with one of the least adequate retirement funds in the world. In the second part of the video, we had shown you how the PAP had used your CPF, HDB and debt to entrap Singaporeans. In this part of the video, let's look at when the whole PAP entrapment plan began. When Raffles first came to Singapore in 1819 until 1963, Singapore was colonized by Britain for 144 years. However, things has never changed. Today, Singapore is colonized by the PAP for more than 50 years now since 1963. Singaporeans, we have never been free. We have never had autonomy to rule because the PAP is in power and they have taken all control of Singapore. And the PAP has created such an unequal system that the richest in Singapore are paid the highest wages among the high-income countries and one of the highest wages in the world. And the richest in Singapore pays the lowest tax and CPF among the high-income countries and one of the lowest taxes in the world. Meanwhile, for the low income in Singapore, we have to pay 37% of our wages into tax and CPF. And for the medium income earner, we have to pay 38% of our wages into tax and CPF. But for the richest in Singapore, they only have to pay 25% of their wages into tax and CPF. Because there is only a cap of $5,000 that you need to pay for CPF. If you earn above $5,000, you only have to pay CPF on the first $5,000. Now, but even though the richest in Singapore earn one of the highest salaries in the world, the rest of Singaporeans actually earn the lowest wages among the high-income countries. So what this means is that because Singapore is now such an unequal country, only the richest 13% are able to meet the CPF minimum sum. The richest 10% has seen their income share grow from 30% in 1995 to 42% in 2011. And the richest 15% in Singapore earns as much as the poorest 85%. So what this means is that because Singapore has become so unequal, only the richest 15% can get ahead. For the rest of us 85%, too bad. And do you know that just by salary alone, Lee Hsien Loong belongs to the richest 0.1% in Singapore, and the PAP's members of parliament belong to the richest 5% in Singapore. In fact, another report has shown that the richest 3% in Singapore owns more than 85% of the wealth in Singapore. So the PAP has created such an unequal system in Singapore. They have allowed the rich to get richer, they have allowed themselves to get richer. So Lee Hsien Loong can claim that he wants to bring in more billionaires into Singapore because even if income inequality grows, Singaporeans will be better off. Now this is rubbish. Singaporeans are not better off. Income inequality is high. Singaporeans' wages are low. The government's expenditure on social spending is low, and the PAP is unwilling to protect Singaporeans. In fact, Singapore is getting richer and richer, but as you have seen, the wealth in Singapore is flowing out of Singapore, the rich gets richer, but the poor gets poorer, and the poverty rate in Singapore has been growing. So today, Singapore has the fourth highest concentration of billionaires in the world. Singapore also has the highest concentration of millionaires in the world. And this has pushed up prices so much that Singapore has now become the most expensive place to live in the world. And the PAP has the cheek to release their own survey to tell Singaporeans that Singapore is only the 60th most expensive for Singaporeans. We have so many billionaires and millionaires in Singapore, but Singapore also has the highest poverty rate among the high-income countries, among the Southeast Asian countries, and among the Asian countries. At 28%, the poverty rate in Singapore is as high as a third world country. Now, do you still think that Singapore is a first world country? Now, if poverty rate is so high, it is ridiculous if the PAP claims that they should not introduce the poverty line because there is a so-called cliff effect. Now the truth is that the PAP is unwilling to define the poverty line because if they do so, Singaporeans will realize that 30% of us are actually not living good lives at all. And so it's complete rubbish for the PAP to claim that income inequality has stabilized. Now what the PAP wants to create is a super rich class on the top and a poverty class at the bottom. And Mr. Leong Tze-Hian has highlighted how mid-skilled jobs in Singapore are disappearing. What this means is that the PAP wants to squeeze out the middle class, so that the middle class are either pushed to migrate, and already 300,000 Singaporeans have migrated, or 10% of the population, or the PAP will push them into the poverty class. Now, do you know why the PAP claims that a degree is not important? Why do you need a degree when you should belong to the poverty class? And now, do you understand why the PAP believes that it is not important to be completely transparent? Because they're afraid that Singaporeans will find out more about what is going wrong in this country, and Singaporeans will find out what the PAP is trying to do, that the PAP is trying to cut down on Singaporeans and marginalize us. And this is why the PAP believes that knowing too much is not in our interests, because they do not want us to know. It has nothing to do with our interests whatsoever. The PAP doesn't care about our interests. The PAP only cares for themselves. So now that you know the PAP's plan to cut Singaporeans down, when did this all begin? In 1984, when Goh Chok Tong introduced MediSave, Mr. Toh Chin Chye argued against it. He called the MediSave a recessive tax because low-income Singaporeans will have to pay the full amount to MediSave, whereas high-income Singaporeans do not. He also said that the MediSave was a very short-sighted, myopic view. He also said that no firm can afford to have two parallel medical welfare schemes. In 1984, Mr. Toh Chin Chye had spoken out because he knew that the PAP was starting to make Singaporeans double pay on essential services. And he knew that this was ethically not correct, and the government should not be double charging on its citizens. And as mentioned, in 1984, the PAP had wanted to delay retirement, but because they couldn't do so, they put in a CPF minimum sum so that they could trap our money in the CPF and force us to work longer. So after introducing the MediSave in 1984, the PAP pushed down what they would pay for healthcare from more than 40% to 30%, and they forced Singaporeans to pay more from our MediSave. And you can see that since then, Singaporeans have to pay into MediSave as well as to tax to finance our healthcare. Yet, as you have seen, what we have put into our MediSave thus far is able to pay for what the government is spending for the next 10 years. There is no need for us to double pay on tax and then on MediSave. And after 1984, the PAP pushed down what they should be paying for Singaporeans for our healthcare and pushed up what Singaporeans have to pay for our healthcare, such that since then, Singaporeans have to pay more and more out of pocket, whereas the PAP is only willing to pay 30% for health. Now, if you compare what the PAP is willing to pay for health as compared to all the high-income countries, no other high-income countries pay such an embarrassing low percentage on health. In fact, for the other countries which have the same GDP per capita as Singapore, their governments would pay 85% on health, whereas the PAP is only willing to pay 30%. So you see, in 1984, the PAP has embarked on a plan to cut down on Singaporeans by introducing the MediSave, by introducing the CPF minimum sum to force us to work longer, and by forcing Singaporeans to pay more for our healthcare. In 1994, the PAP reduced the wage share to a low of 40% for no reason. The PAP increased the CPF contributions to a high 40% peak. The PAP allowed the CPF to be used to purchase HDB resale flats, which drove up HDB prices. And the PAP then started increasing the income share that goes to the rich, and they decided to pay themselves millions in salaries. In 1994, the PAP also pushed down the CPF interest rates to a low 2.5%. And after 1984, the PAP also spiked up the CPF minimum sum, such that it increased to such a high level that it trapped Singaporeans' CPF, and we are not able to save and retire. From 2004, the PAP embarked on an expansion plan. In 2004, the number of foreign workers coming into Singapore started expanding. And as I had written, in 2004, Singtel's profits also shot up. Now, Singtel is the largest company in Singapore and it is owned by the government. Did the other companies which are owned by the government also see their profits shoot up in 2004? Also in 2004, the Prime Minister's salary increased by leaps and bounds to a high of $4 million. Now, if you can see the trend, there seems to be a 10-year cycle that the PAP embarks on that cuts down Singaporeans periodically. It happened in 1984, it happened in 1994, it happened in 2004. This year, we are in 2014. What will the PAP do to Singaporeans? How will the PAP embark on a plan to further cut down on Singaporeans? Last year, the PAP introduced the Singapore Population White Paper. In the Population White Paper, the PAP wanted to cut down on Singaporeans. Is this their plan? Now, about 1984 might not even be the start of where it all began. In 1974, the PAP set up the Temasek Holdings. This was followed by the GIC in 1981. The whole PAP entrapment plans relies on the PAP owning the government, businesses, unions, CPF, the land, HDB, and then channel all that money into the investment firms Temasek Holdings and GIC, which gets channeled back to the PAP. So that all this began in 1974 with the setting up of the Temasek Holdings. So finally, let me explain to you what this whole magic PAP entrapment plan is. Out of the GDP, the PAP has decided to give us the lowest 42% wage share among the developed countries, and they have calculated very carefully how much this wage share should be. So that of this wage share, they will then take back this wage via the highest contribution to CPF, and for the rest of the money that we have left, they give them back for their essential services. And for the poorest 30% in Singapore, the PAP has calculated how low they need to pay these workers so that after deducting for their CPF, they are left with a debt of 5 to 51%. And for the wage that the PAP is willing to give us, they have cut out a large chunk for the CPF, they have calculated how much they need to increase prices for their essential services and push up prices to earn profits, and they have calculated how much they can force Singaporeans to double pay on these essential services so that they can earn profits as well. Singaporeans are thus forced to pay the highest CPF contribution in the world. We are forced to receive possibly the lowest CPF interest rates in the world, yet the PAP takes our money and earns possibly the highest interest rates in the world. And for the interest that is not returned back to Singaporeans, this is actually a tax that Singaporeans are paying to the PAP. So then the PAP decided to allow Singaporeans to use the CPF to purchase a HDB resale flats, which drove up prices. And of the CPF, the PAP has calculated how much they need to increase for prices for the HDB flats so that they can force us to extract a huge proportion of our CPF into the housing mortgage, a huge proportion into the CPF accrued interest on top of the mortgage, and finally with whatever is left in the CPF, to put in a CPF minimum sum to trap your money in the CPF. Singaporeans are thus forced into a household debt of 77.2% of GDP. And because the PAP takes our money from our CPF and claim to borrow it, Singaporeans have to go into a national debt of 115% of GDP. And because we have to pay back this debt, we owe another 115% of GDP, which means that the PAP is forcing Singaporeans to take a debt of more than 300% of GDP. So each Singaporeans end up having a debt of $360,000, and because we would have to work 20 years to pay off this debt, we would only be able to retire at 85 or we'll never be able to retire. So here you go. In 1974, the PAP set up the Temasek Holdings. In 1984, they introduced the MediSave, the CPF minimum sum. They forced Singaporeans to double pay for our health. They reduced their expenditure on health and forced us to increase our expenditure on health. In 1994, the PAP reduced the wage share. They increased the share of income for the rich. They increased our CPF contribution rate but reduced our CPF interest rate, yet spike up the CPF minimum sum. They allowed the CPF to be used to buy HDB resale flats, privatize essential services, and then increase their own salaries to millions of dollars. In 2004, they further reduced the wage share. They increased the number of foreign workers as part of their expansion plan. They increased the profits of monopolized companies such as Singtel, and they increased their own salaries to even more millions. So what is going to happen to Singaporeans in 2004? What other insidious scheme does the PAP have to cut down on Singaporeans and to marginalize us?
I'm sorry, the PAP doesn't care for you. After watching these videos, you will realize that the PAP entrapment plans extends to all part of the Singapore society. The PAP might claim that they want to help Singaporeans, and the PAP might claim that they want to reduce income inequality. However, the PAP spends the least on social assistance on Singaporeans as compared to all the other high-income countries. In fact, the PAP also spends lesser than other third world countries. Now the PAP is in position to do more than it can now. It has entrapped a lot of our debts and a lot of our money in the CPF and tax. But why is the PAP not returning this back to Singaporeans? The only logical conclusion that you can have is that the PAP is not interested in taking care of Singaporeans. Now the PAP has hijacked the government. They've channeled all the money that they have earned from Singaporeans into these investment funds and earned for themselves. Now this is your money. This is your retirement funds. This is your homes. The PAP cannot walk into government and abuse Singaporeans. 30% of Singaporeans are trapped in perpetual debt, and 30% of Singaporeans are forced to be disempowered. Now this is not the way to run a country, and it is highly irresponsible for the PAP to do something like that. In order for the Singapore society to be uplifted, all Singaporeans should receive fair wages. Singaporeans should be supported for basic essentials like healthcare and education. In other countries which have a GDP per capita as high as Singapore, their citizens receive free healthcare and free education because their governments know that if you want your workers to be productive and you want them to be in a good state of health, you will protect them and you will ensure that they are able to access healthcare and education. Now, but what we're asking from the government is not anything out of the ordinary. As a government, there is a moral responsibility for the government to take care of the people. And there's a moral responsibility for the government to create environment and spaces that will ensure that the people are able to develop to their full potential. It is not right and it is not fair for the PAP to create such inequality so that they can get ahead for themselves. Now Singaporeans, you need to stand up and you need to protect yourself. You need to be aware. We need to find out what is going on in our country, what is wrong, and we need to take a stand and be prepared to fight. We cannot let the PAP continue to ruin our country, and we cannot let them hijack the government. We cannot let this go on anymore. Now you have to take a stand, and you have to be prepared to fight.
On the 3rd of May, we will be holding an event to advocate for the rights of Singaporeans for fair wages and rightful employment. Now Singaporeans, it is time that we stand up and we fight for ourselves. Now the PAP is unwilling to give Singaporeans fair wages, and the PAP is unwilling to enact laws to protect the employment of Singaporeans. We cannot take this sitting down. We need to speak up and we need to have a voice. If we are able to stand united, we will create a Singapore that we can be proud of. On 3rd of May, join us. Let's come together and create a society that will benefit all Singaporeans and protect all Singaporeans, and a Singapore that we can all be proud of.